I've heard several conservative commentators say that basically that there's no better place in the world to be than America for racial tolerance and whatnot. I don't think that's true. I think race relations in Canada are markedly better than they are in the US. In this video, I'm speaking with close friend and cognitive scientist, Dr. John Wilder. John and I met in grad school at Rutgers University in New Jersey. John is American, but has lived in Toronto for the past 10 years, whereas I'm Torontonian, but have lived in Arizona for the past 8. In this video, we talk about our experiences living in each of these great countries, discussing differences with respect to healthcare, education, political strife, race relations, social assistance, and the defense of freedom. All right, so Canada, US. I'm a Canadian in Tucson for over 8 years. John is from Minnesota, then lived in New Jersey and New York City now he's been in Toronto for probably somewhere in the ballpark of 10. You were a permanent resident in Canada first. You had like basically a
Yep.
Canadian card. Now you're a citizen. I'm a green card holder in the US. How would you compare your experience living in a few different American places to Toronto?
So Minnesota is a lot like Canada. So there is some similarity there. The West Coast was just really fast paced in the US.
Okay.
And when I moved to Toronto, it was just a much more chill city than like New York.
Yeah, I don't think many Torontonians would say that.
Yeah.
Like no Canadians like, oh, I'm going to Toronto because it's chill. No Canadian has ever said.
No, it feels more relaxed. Like the stores shut down earlier, especially on Sunday, and it's like, I don't know, it feels different than New York. But then like language wise, there's some similarities to Minnesota. But I mean, I guess I always thought of it as like it's just like the US, just colder. But growing up in Minnesota, it was cold there too. So
One thing I found is I've heard several conservative commentators say that basically that there's no better place in the world to be than America for for racial tolerance and whatnot. I don't think that's true. I think race relations in Canada are markedly better than they are in the US.
mhm.
And like with the exception, I'd say things are probably comparably bad when it comes to natives or indigenous peoples. But when it comes to like black-white relations and so forth, I would put Canada head and shoulders above the States. What do you think?
I agree, especially Toronto because it's so like metropolitan and diverse.
Yeah.
Um, where when you get out to the smaller areas, the race relationships will be less good because people don't have the same experience as being in the city where there's people from all over the world.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Um, but I think the history in the US is different, and that sets things up in a more tense way already. And so I agree, but I have been surprised sometimes at the different negative racial interactions I've seen in Canada.
Oh
Where
yeah.
like not long after I got here, I was at a bank and I was opening some accounts, and so I'm in a small room with one of the banking agents, and somebody comes up and was getting angry at the teller and started shouting racial slurs at them. And it's like I was quite surprised. So it's like there still are instances like Canada isn't perfect.
Of course. Of course.
But I would say in general, it's better. But like growing up, I grew up in Minnesota, and kind of the lie I was taught growing up in Minnesota is that Minnesota is in the north, so we're very like good about race relationships,
Mhm.
and we don't have the same history, negative history of slavery, where if you go to the south, they do.
Mhm.
And I would see some like stereotypes or like people had negative views, and part of it was there was just less diversity, and so there were less negative interactions because it was more homogenous. But I don't think the core beliefs were very like I think a lot of the core beliefs were racist, and you just didn't see it because there wasn't as many racial interactions.
Right.
Um, and then like one of the things you learn in school in Minnesota is about how it's like, The Minnesota units in the Civil War stole the Confederate flag, and we have it hanging in our museum that we stole it. And like, I don't know if it's Virginia or where, keeps asking for their flag back, and we keep saying, no, we won that war. When Jesse Ventura was governor, they asked for it back, and they passed that state passed some resolution saying we demand it back, and Jesse's like, no, last time I checked, we won, so you don't get it back. And so it's like, that was a point of pride. It's like, yeah, we defeated the racists. And then as I got older, there was a lot more negative racial interactions. Like in the city I grew up in, there was two big high schools in the city, and one of them had sort of negative interactions, not between like the Caucasian population, but the different minority groups clashing. And then as I got older, it became apparent that, Minneapolis and St. Paul doesn't have that great of race interactions. When I was looking for postdocs, I'd been considering Minneapolis at U of M, and we were driving around looking for, potential places to live. And that was one of the streets we were driving on was a street where the man was shot by the police officer in his car, wherein his daughter was in the back seat.
Fernando Castillo.
And yes, yeah.
Well, so
yeah.
Is there any, what kind of things, if any, what do you like better about Toronto than what you're used to in the States? Although I know the places you live in the States are very different from each other.
So, I mean, just the feeling in the U.S. is a lot more about surveillance. So when we were in grad school, we had a kid, and the U.S. has this program, Women, Infant, Child, where they help pay for food for low-income families, and as a grad student, we qualified as low income, so that you give them good nutrition at a young age, because in the long run, that will pay off, because they'll have less health problems, they'll grow up, more healthy, and that will help them learn better. Yeah, but you're constantly going to places to re-show that, yes, I qualify still, and it's I'm not using it, I'm not misusing it, I am clean. I don't have drug convictions and all this stuff. And so it just seemed like in all the sort of welfare programs, there's a lot more people checking in on it and making sure you're not being cheated. And here in Canada, when we first started, we moved here when I had a 2-week-old. And when my wife started working, we were looking at daycare, but it was really expensive because she hadn't been working, because she had just had a kid. And it took 6 months to get her credentials transferred up here so that she could start working. And we said, okay, we were meeting with this group that would say, okay, you get subsidized daycare. And we qualified, and we were telling them, well, my wife started working, so she's going to get this much income. And they're like, yeah, we know, but you're still going to give us full free daycare for a year? And they're like, yeah. And I felt like we were cheating them. And we said, so we'll get this much money, you're clear on that? And they said, yes. The goal is that you haven't been having that much money, so you've been getting behind, and you've not been saving, and you've not been paying off loans.
Right.
So this is here to help you do all that, so that then next year, now that you've made that money, you won't qualify anymore. You won't get any subsidy for daycare, not even a partial one. But this is
sense. Yeah. Because it's they're trying to incentivize by facilitating parents to have more kids, because the birth rate decline over the last many decades.
Mm-hmm.
So I think one of the big problems in places basically the kind of places that most people that are not in Canada, if you ask them would you want to move to in Canada, they'd say places like Toronto and Vancouver. They're unbelievably expensive to live in. And so you're a good example of that. Your wife is a clinical psychologist, you've got a PhD with several postdocs, mm-hmm. You've got a very solid full-time long-term teaching job in an analytics department at a university. And you guys haven't owned your first house yet, and you're 39, I think.
Yeah, I'm 39.
And it's you're not planning on buying for at least another 4 or 5 years, probably, right?
No.
That's absolutely crazy. So people often ask me, I work in healthcare here. They'll say things like, "Is it better in Canada because you guys have free healthcare, and and education is way cheaper?" And the way I put it is, yes, healthcare and education are much cheaper in Canada, but absolutely
everything else is more.
Is worse. Now I'm in Tucson. Tucson is cheap. Tucson's not New York City or Seattle. right? So bear that in mind. But I literally pay probably, I don't know, 40% less for Crown Royal in Tucson than I would
Mhm.
in Toronto. It's made in
So
Toronto.
yeah, so with that, I agree, but some of the things have been nice. Like before I got a full-time job, I was adjunct teaching and
Yes.
working as a contractor with software companies, and none of those give benefits.
But you didn't need them.
I didn't need them because I have healthcare. And
Exactly.
so it's like I wouldn't have that opportunity in the US because
Mm.
I have 3 kids. If I don't have healthcare, it's a problem.
Yeah, so in that way, I think Peterson years ago said that in some ways you could say the American dream is more attainable in Canada because a big part of the American dream for many is entrepreneurialism, and
Yes.
a lot harder to break off from your full-time benefits providing job to start your own gig because there goes your
Yep.
insurance. Whereas in Canada, they're completely decoupled, so you can go do that side business,
Yep.
or it doesn't compromise your insurance. So that's a
Yes.
big deal.
Yep. I think that's a huge difference. The not having stress about that
Yeah. Well,
also makes me more productive.
yeah, because that could be a major source of stress for a person.
Yeah.
Like I remember as a kid, I grew up with a single mom, and she was a refugee immigrant. So like like, and she was the only person in her family in our part of the country, and my dad was not helping at all, right? And she probably made like 40 grand a year in the early 90s, which is it's below average. It's not awful, but it's below average. And she had a kid, but even like there was a period where we only had one TV in the house, and it was a 10-inch black and white. But even then, I never had to worry about, and she didn't have to worry about, like, what if one of us gets sick? How are we
Yep.
going to pay the bills? And then also, it's like I never, ever had the thought of I might not be able to go to university. And the only reason for a long time, I didn't know if I'd be able to go to the University of Toronto, but it wasn't financial. It just wasn't, I just didn't know if I would be good enough to get in. But
Hmm.
finances were never the thing. And so, like, and in a way, that really does promote social mobility because, like, I had
Yes. Yep.
I had several friends who were first generation Canadians whose parents immigrated here or there from like India and Sri Lanka and so forth.
Hmm.
And now a bunch of them are six-figure making engineers in Toronto. Well, it's because,
Hmm.
they may have grown up in Ontario housing or maybe one notch above that. But, their parents encouraged them to study hard. And guess what? It paid off. And they
Hmm.
were able to go to university at good schools, even though for money.
Yep. So I think that is a big thing. I know growing up in the US, sort of the mental model we had was, oh, socialist Canada,
Hmm.
and you're not going to get medical care you need. And we're young, so it's easier for us to get medical care than if we were older. And I do have friends who have struggled to get the medical care they need here,
Yes.
but they really push medical care for kids here.
Oh, yeah.
Whenever our kids have been sick, they go all out. They check things. They're very, like, we found out last year my daughter had celiac disease. And, we've talked to people and they're like, well, why did the doctor think to check that? And it's like, well, they were just doing tests and like one more. And it's like, in the US, you don't add just one more test because that adds a lot of money and the insurance don't want to cover that. And now we're gluten free in the home because she has celiac disease. And now we're paying the higher grocery prices because Canada's really expensive for groceries
Yes.
and gluten free is even more expensive. But it's like, yeah, the medical care was never an issue. Ontario for a while had a universal basic income pilot program.
Mhm.
And at the like that also seemed like one of these crazy socialist Canada ideas that like would never fly in the US. And for me at first I'm like, why do we want to do that? And I think social mobility is a huge reason why it started to make sense to me the more I looked into it. The pilot program was canceled, so we never actually got to see if it helped out. But the idea that you don't have to worry about losing your job and losing insurance, I can go back to school and
Mhm.
I know I'll get some income so that I can be better trained to do a job I'm going to enjoy more, which means I'm going to work harder at it and be more productive. Instead, now I'm nervous because I don't want to get fired doing a job I hate. I'll put up with more abuse from my boss because I don't have any other options. And that's not great. Or it's like if I'm a single mom and I have an abusive husband, not a single mom, sorry, I'm a mother, a stay-at-home mom,
Yeah.
abusive husband, I can't leave
You're right.
because I can't afford to be a stay-at-home single mom.
Mhm.
But if I have universal basic income, I can get out of that bad situation and go to school so that I can then work and support my family away from this bad situation. And so I started, I mean, Canada started turning me into more of a socialist. But like even some capitalists have talked about that, where it's like, I see his face, I can't think of the name. He was big in the Chicago School of Economics, Milton Friedman, I think it was, who had said, well, the economy won't work right. Like, you need the invisible hand to work right. It's going to tell you where resources should be distributed. But when we have a class of people who can't vote with their money, who they can't say where they want to support, that's going to disrupt the market. And so having this universal basic income can actually help the market allocate resources, because now everybody has a vote. But it doesn't take away, like, a rich person is still sort of getting more of a vote. And so if you're in the capitalist idea that they're contributing more to society and that's why they earn more, and so that's why they get a bigger vote, we still have that. It's not going away, but at least now everybody's contributing. So the market signals are going to flow more freely. And so it's like, ooh, yeah, I mean, that seemed like this crazy socialist idea before I got here. And now, like, I wish Ontario was still trying it so we could see if the data worked out and said, yes, it promotes like education and better social situations. But there is just a calm in Toronto or Canada in general that I've seen, because people aren't worried about these different things. And when they want social supports, they don't feel like they're sort of just being distrusted all the time.
All right, just had to relocate there. So wrapping up.
So growing up, my family was a family of the American dream. My grandparents came over on immigrant ships after World War II with nothing. My grandma and great-grandma had been in a concentration camp for people with German heritage in Yugoslavia. So it was a Russian concentration camp, not a Nazi one. But they escaped that, had nothing, and we were safely middle class. And so it's like we lived the American dream, and we were raised to recognize it. Like, we were patriots. And I would have never imagined living in a different country. I visited other countries, but it was always, yeah, like, US is the best country in the world. It is a land of opportunity. Look what my family did. And I still think it's great. But when I moved to Toronto, I'd planned on being here for a 2-year postdoc and then moving back. And we love Toronto. And we love that ability to relax and know, like, healthcare isn't an issue. Maybe when we're older, we'll feel differently when we're having more health problems, but the healthcare judgments are that it's not worth the money because I'm not going to get the value back out of it. But there's higher taxes, but I'm okay paying that because I think some of the stuff is valuable, and I don't begrudge the government doing some of what they do.
The hard thing is, though, is that yes, healthcare and education are much more attainable, achievable, or whatever, affordable. But everything else, and so it's like, if like in not all Canada is the same, and not all America is the same. Like, I'm from a Tucson perspective where it's very affordable. I'm not talking from Seattle or New York City.
Yeah.
For me, it's like, I don't like it when I go see my PCP and it costs me $100 just to like do what would have been a 20-minute free visit in Canada. But then I remember that my house cost 1/3 the amount. I paid like, my car cost less, my car insurance cost less, my groceries, my alcohol, my everything I want to do except those 2 things. So there's 3 things: healthcare, education, and sushi. Those are the only 3 things that are expensive in Tucson. Everything else is cheaper, often radically so. And that's a big problem in Canada. Like, you have places like Toronto and Vancouver where it's very hard for young people to launch because you like the average home value in Toronto like is probably somewhere in the ballpark of $1 million Canadian, which is somewhere in the high sevens to eight
That's
hundred.
about 1.5 right now, actually.
Unbelievable. So yeah, so that's probably about 1.1, 1.2 million American average house in
Yep.
Toronto. Imagine you're a 26-year-old in Toronto and you want to get your life started. Like what ends up happening is you have to leave and move further and further out, and you have
Yep.
to move a long way out before it starts making a difference. Like you could be
Yes.
an hour out and it's still going to cost you 900 grand.
Yep.
So that's tough. But yeah, so there, yeah, healthcare and education, I would say better in Canada. In terms of accessibility, like there's an inflection point, I would say, for healthcare. Like if you are at or above a certain level in the States financially, you're probably better off here because yeah, you'll pay a little more, but your wait times will be less. But
So
you can afford it.
when delivering a baby in the US was a so much better experience for us than Canada. We had 2 kids in the US, 1 here.
Yeah.
And but I was coming from an experience where as a graduate student, we were counted as state employees of New Jersey, so we had the state employee health plan. It was amazing.
Mm.
We didn't get a private room, even with our supplemental insurance in Canada,
Mm.
where that's the standard at our hospital where we were in New Jersey.
Wow.
And they gave us diapers. We didn't know we had to bring our own diapers to the hospital in Canada.
Yeah.
So stuff wasn't provided, and so it's like there is benefits. Or when we first had to buy EpiPens,
Mm.
The insurance that we had, so drug coverage isn't part of the normal health coverage. You have to get that coverage through your job, and the way it was handled is you had to pay and then submit for reimbursement. And we needed an EpiPen for my daughter, one for her daycare, one for her school, one for me, and one for the mom, so that like we had it all. Anybody she was with at any point would have one. And that was like $200 a piece. And we got reimbursed for 80% of it. But it's like just moving to Canada, where we only had one working parent who was a postdoc, not earning much. It's like that was a big burden.
Yeah.
And so when I heard like, well, what is this talk about Canadian healthcare being better?
Hmm.
When I have to pay for this out of pocket and then get reimbursed, when in the US they just gave it to me. And it's like, well, I didn't have the standard US experience. Like I had excellent health insurance. The New Jersey state health insurance was great.
Right.
So it depends on where you are in the US and what your positions are.
So I'd say healthcare, I wouldn't say it's better. Like it's hard to say, is it better in period in one than the other? Although I guess some people would argue that it's not hard to do that. But what I think you could say is there's an income inflection point where if you're below that point, you're better off in Canada. And there's a certain window where it's probably roughly similar. And then if you're above it, you're better off in the States because you'll pay, but you can afford it and your wait times are way low. And maybe your work covers a lot of the insurance cost, things like that. So there's that. Education, way cheaper and more accessible in Canada. I give the massive edge to Canada on that. Some people will say the University of Toronto is the Harvard of Canada. There is no Harvard of Canada. We don't have a single institution that is that ritzy, that is that fancy, that is that exclusive. It doesn't exist. Race relations, I give Canada a huge edge, except for natives. There, it's probably similar. I don't know. Maybe it's even worse in Canada. I don't know. But it's certainly, I wouldn't say it's better, but overall, better. Political division, way worse in America, way worse. Canadian liberals and conservatives, they piss each other off and they don't like each other much, but the hatred like in the States is just off the charts. So I give edge to Canada on that. To America, I like that people here take their freedoms, I think on average more seriously than Canadians. I was so disappointed by Canadians just being doormats over draconian COVID policies. Though I had mixed feelings when the truckers came out because they like on the one hand, I'm like, yes, finally some Canadians with a backbone. It only took 2 years, but finally, right? But then on the other hand, it's like they were behaving in ways that if BLM did the exact same things, I would want the book thrown at them. So ultimately, like I agreed with their cause and their purpose, but I disagreed with them blocking borders and whatnot, things like that. So that was wrong. But on the whole, I think Americans do seem to care more and are more willing to defend their freedom. So I'd give the edge to America on that.
And for me, I would say I liked some of those restrictions but I'm coming from a place where I have kids with respiratory issues,
Hmm.
and so the more careful other people are, the safer it was for them.
No,
And
fair point, fair point. So I get it, but yeah, this is literally safety versus freedom.
yes.
But yeah, so it's a complex mixture, and what you're gonna like better, whether you like. Oh yeah, and the weather here is way better. But yeah, if you're gonna like Canada or US better, it's gonna depend on things like, what, like, are you lefty or are you righty? That's gonna make a difference. What's your income? That's gonna make a difference. What's, your race? That probably will make a difference.
I mean, I know, being in academics, where during the, I mean, just seeing where students pick to go,
Hmm.
there was a lot of students who I saw on interview days in Canada who were talking from other countries or places saying, we're choosing Canada because we don't want to go to the US right now.
Hmm.
And so there was this nervousness by some, like, other countries, or like other people who wouldn't even be allowed, like Iranian students coming to Canada.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's kind of like the analogy I could use is like, I just said a few minutes ago, the Canadian liberals and conservatives, they're not like super crazy about each other, but their level of inter-tribal disdain is like nothing compared to Dems versus Republicans.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of reminds me of this time when I was in South Korea teaching English, and I met a guy from Manhattan, also teaching English. And, this is after I lived in Jersey. And so when he told me he was from Manhattan, I said, oh, that's cool. I used to live in Jersey and I'd go visit there sometimes. I managed to offend him 3 times in 5 seconds unintentionally, because what I said to him was, that's cool. I went to Manhattan a bunch of times. I liked it, but I preferred Brooklyn. That's offense number one, because I picked the wrong borough. Because it reminds me of Boston. That's offense
Oh,
number two, because New
that's
York,
the worst one, probably, right?
right? Which is my favorite city that I've been to in the US so far. And the thing is, I knew there was a conflict between New York and Boston, but I thought it was kind of like the Toronto Montreal one, where it's all mostly in good fun. We don't actually dislike each other. It's just ribbing. I figured it was like that. It's like, no, these people do not like each other. And so it's kind of reminding me of, like, the Canadian left right versus American left right. It's just so much more amped up in America. And it's
Mm-hmm.
not a good thing.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I like both, but I really love Toronto. Like,
Uh,
when I left Minnesota, it was because I wanted to be in a big city. And then I moved to New York, and it's like, oh, this big city is not for me.
yeah.
I thought maybe I need to be a country person.
Hmm.
But like both Toronto and Vancouver, it's like I could really live here.
Amazing.
Now it's expensive, so I'm lucky enough that I can afford it. But and that we're getting under market value in the house we're renting because of rent control.
Right.
But
Well, just don't go saying anything politically incorrect. Have all the right opinions for the next bunch of years, and maybe one of these days, if you win like 17 or 18 consecutive lotteries, you might be able to afford a house in Toronto.